Cuba has often moved in a different direction to the rest of Latin America, gaining independence later, enjoying stability when other countries face crisis, but never consolidating a democracy. To find out why, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of Cuba. We don't know exactly when people first arrived in Cuba, but archaeologists estimate humans have been living in the island since at least 4000 BCE. More recently, we know that by the time the Spanish first showed up, there were at least three groups of distinct people in the island: the Guanajuato, Siboney, and Taínos. The first was an earlier group living on the western side of Cuba who had been displaced by the latter two, and that unlike the Taínos, who practiced agriculture, lived mostly off of foraging and shellfish. The Spanish first encountered Cuba as part of Columbus's voyage in 1492, but it would take them until 1511 to establish Baracoa, their first permanent settlement in the island, and 3 more years to gain complete control of it. That was largely due to the stiff resistance of the Taínos and one of their leaders, Atuey, who was captured and executed on February 2, 1512, at Yara, near present-day Bayamo. Soon after, in 1519, the Spanish established Havana in its current location, a city that would become its main port of call as it expanded its empire into the rest of the Americas, and later as it extracted gold to be sent back to the mother country. This naturally made it a target for pirates, and it was regularly attacked, including in 1555 when Jacques de Sauret, a French corsair, burned it to the ground. Cuba's economy originally revolved around tobacco farming and subsequently coffee cultivation, but after the Haitian Revolution, it gradually became a plantation economy based on sugar as it looked to replace Saint-Domingue's place in the global economic system. The combination of sugar, slavery, and the plantation economy shaped the colonial social structure and laid the foundation for an economy geared to foreign commerce, but it did not produce a society of small landowners and rural proprietors. This hierarchy and the tight Spanish control made it so that the winds of change from the 1820s in Latin America passed it by despite multiple uprisings. The first attempt to seriously threaten Spanish power in the island did not happen until 1868. It developed mainly because Spain refused to grant judicial equality or representation in parliament to Cubans, and because the Spaniards, representing 8% of the island's population, were appropriating 90% of the wealth. Plantation owners in the east were particularly irked by this, so that's precisely where the insurrection began. Led by Carlos Manuel de Cespedes and immortalized by Cubans as El Grito de Yara, or Cry of Yara, in his manifesto, the insurgency called for the abolishment of slavery and a new independent Cuba where all men would be considered equal, even Spaniards, if they chose to remain and live peacefully in Cuba. The conflict was devastating for the island. Known as the 10 Years' War, Big War, or La Guerra Grande, it decimated Cuba's infrastructure and resulted in 250,000 people dying, including Cespedes himself and his youngest son, Oscar, who famously was captured by the Spanish and executed after his father refused to put down his weapons in exchange for Oscar's life, saying that he was the father of all Cubans. Even after all that, it solved few of the problems that had given rise to the insurgency in the first place. Although slavery was abolished soon after, Spain did not do enough to accommodate the other demands. So for the next 20 years, tensions would continue and 2 new wars would develop. The first was the so-called Little War, or Guerra Chiquita, between 1879 and 1880, and the second was the War of Independence, which would begin in 1895. The second was what would eventually lead to Cuban independence. It was led by new leaders, principally José Martí, a poet, essayist, and intellectual who had been writing in favor of Cuban independence since he was a teenager. This time, the separatists were in a stronger position than they were in the 1860s. They were more unified and better funded, whereas Spain vacillated between granting meaningful reforms and reimposing absolutist government. Unfortunately for the Cubans' cause, only a few months after landing with a small invading contingent, Martí was killed at the Battle of Dos Rios. His military inexperience ended up costing him dearly. Still, the rest of the leaders, Máximo Gómez and Antonio Maceo, soldiered on. Using sophisticated guerrilla tactics, by January 1896, they had managed to take control of most of the country. Facing the imminent loss of the island, the Spanish put a new general in charge, Valeriano Weyler, who promptly set out to use scorched earth tactics like the use of concentration camps, where the Spanish would forcefully move people living in the countryside into towns so that the rebels could neither hide nor recruit among them. The strategy caused massive famine, the spread of disease, and routine soldier abuse against civilians. Historians estimate that as a result of the measure, no less than 300,000 people died. The atrocities turned the tide, and the war soon entered into a military stalemate. But even after that, the rebels still controlled large parts of the country. So the Spanish changed their strategy yet again, this time replacing Weyler and offering home rule to the Cubans. It was too little too late. The rebels rejected it, and soon the U.S. would enter the war against the Spanish. The Cuban question had become an important issue in U.S. domestic politics, and Spain as well as the rebels had attempted to influence American public opinion. Weyler's atrocities in particular had shaped how the United States saw the conflict. The immediate spark, however, was the explosion of the USS Maine, a ship that had been sent to the Havana harbor to protect U.S. interests during the war. To this day, historians disagree on what caused the blast, but whether it was accidental or not, its sinking and the death of 3/4 of its crew sent American newspapers into a frenzy as they called for war against Spain. It worked. On April 21, 1898, the U.S. declared war on Spain and promptly dealt a decisive blow to Spanish aspirations. Within just 3 months, the Europeans sued for peace and gave up not just Cuba, but Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Guam. Americans went on to occupy the island until 1902. This, scholars believe, created a legacy of resentment and frustration because U.S. intervention prevented the Cubans from achieving a complete victory over Spain. American military authorities partly rebuilt the nation's infrastructure and brought about significant improvements in public health, education, public administration, and finance. But Cuban nationalists and many intellectuals felt a sense of political impotence. Subsequently, the inclusion of the Platt Amendment in the Cuban Constitution meant that Cuba became a U.S. protectorate rather than a sovereign nation, because the amendment granted territorial concessions to the United States, placed financial restrictions on the Cuban government, and allowed the U.S. to intervene in Cuba's internal affairs. The Americans also imposed a 1903 Reciprocity Treaty, which granted preferential treatment to Cuban sugar in the U.S. market and reduced tariffs on American exports to Cuba. U.S. investments in Cuba's sugar industry, cattle industry, public services, utilities, and other properties had reached $200 billion by 1909, nearly 50% of all foreign investment in Cuba. The Platt Amendment and the Reciprocity Treaty facilitated a growing U.S. influence in Cuba and were often perceived as neocolonialist measures aimed at protecting American interests in the island. The U.S. presence created a significant political cleavage, separating those people who felt it to be beneficial and necessary for Cuba's early development from nationalists who saw it as a direct infringement of genuine self-determination. Political competition during the early 20th century existed predominantly between the liberal and conservative parties. These parties, and others, did not articulate clear political philosophies or programs and were essentially controlled by the political caudillos José Miguel Gómez and Mario García Menocal, both of whom had fought in the War of Independence. The political system was based on client arrangements and patronage networks. Electoral fraud and administrative corruption were common. Public office was held in disrepute, politics was used as a means of self-enrichment, and the democratic ideals that had motivated Martí and other revolutionary leaders remained little more than abstractions. Gerardo Machado, another general that had fought against the Spanish, was elected as a popular president in 1924, but he became a virtual dictator following his contrived re-election in 1928 and his violation of constitutional norms. From that point forward, politics took on a violent character. Government and opposition alike engaged in terrorism, shootings, and political assassinations, indicating that institutions were unable to resolve political conflicts and that force was seen as a legitimate arbiter of political disputes. Meanwhile, the Great Depression had a devastating effect on the economy. Plummeting sugar prices affected the livelihood of hundreds of thousands of families, and unemployment, social misery, and brutal banditry reflected a deeper structural crisis. The government sought to alleviate the problems by acquiring new loans from U.S. bankers, but the country's credit worthiness was shaky, and it had previously accumulated substantial debts. The economic picture deteriorated rapidly, helping stimulate and organize opposition to Machado. Student protesters challenged the police in the streets, but resistance to Machado also involved professionals, middle-class elements, and labor leaders. A diverse number of other anti-Machado groups, with differentiated and often competing agendas, emerged to confront the regime, often using violent means. They included the Popular Socialist Party, or PSP, and the ABC, a secret organization made up of middle sector individuals. In short, the opposition was unified in its commitment to driving Machado from power and ending the dictatorship, but it was also tactically and ideologically divided. With the economic crisis deepening and with Machado apparently determined to stay in office in spite of promises to resign, the army forced him to flee the country in August 1933. Cuba had many presidents in the following years, but they were usually made and unmade by Fulgencio Batista. a sergeant who gained control of the army at the time of Machado's downfall. Carlos Manuel de Cespedes y Quesada, son of the Cuban independence leader, was the first president to serve on a provisional basis. He set aside the Constitution and tried to bring about modest reforms, but was overthrown within a few months as critics feared that he was too closely allied to the U.S. Ramón Grau San Martín was installed in his place. The new president's attempts at reform, progressive though they were also short-lived, and his 4 months in office were characterized by bloody strife. And so it went for nearly a decade with only weak democratic regimes and few truly positive things to speak of except for perhaps the abrogation of the Platt Amendment in 1934. Things began to change in 1940 following the enactment of a democratic and progressive constitution, itself the result of political compromises among the democratic left, conservatives, and communists. This constitution established universal suffrage and freedom of political organization, recognized Western-style civil rights, and abolished the death penalty. Women, children, and workers received social protection, and racial and sexual discrimination was outlawed. Public education was mandated, and the needs of rural children in particular were identified. This gave the country some stability, and for the next 12 years, it had regular elections and peaceful transfers of power, including one from Batista to Grau San Martín. Unfortunately, the democratic regimes were unable to curb corruption. An entire system of nepotism, favoritism, and gangsterism predominated through a complex system of patronage, payoffs, and bribes, so when Batista returned in 1952 and decided to carry out a coup, he faced little to no opposition. That would not last long, however. Batista's return was far more oppressive than it had been in his previous era, jailing his opponents, controlling Congress and the press, and using whatever terror tactics he considered necessary. Soon, several revolutionary groups surfaced, such as the Directorio Revolucionario, or Revolutionary Directory, and Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement. Fidel Castro had received a law degree from the University of Havana in 1950 and had been involved in student politics for years. He had tried running for office in 1952, but Batista's coup closed this option. He soon found alternative ways of challenging the dictatorship. The most famous was his decision to raid the Moncada military garrison in the city of Santiago on July 26, 1953. The attack was lunacy from a tactical standpoint, but it went even worse than they expected, as the rebels ended up being outnumbered 10-1. Naturally, it failed, and many of Fidel's followers were either killed or subsequently arrested and shot. Fidel himself was captured and tried for subversion, but as a trained lawyer with oratorical skills, he used the trial to issue an indictment of the government, portraying his cause as just and inspired by patriotism and Martí's ideals. Fidel called for a return to constitutional government, agrarian reform, profit-sharing arrangements between owners and workers, and social improvements in rural Cuba. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison, but he was subsequently released in 1954 under an amnesty program. This ended up being a crucial mistake on the part of Batista, as Fidel left Cuba for Mexico and immediately began planning an invasion of the island with Cuban exiles. It was in Mexico that he met Ernesto Guevara, an Argentinian medical student whose common use of Argentine slang, analogous to saying man or dude, ended up giving him the nickname everyone knows him by, Che. In 1956, Che, Fidel, his brother Raúl, and 79 others got on a leaking small yacht called Granma and set out to take down Batista. By this point, Batista knew of their intentions, so his forces were waiting for them. After barely making it to the island, Castro's forces were bombarded and almost wiped out. With only a handful of men and Batista's forces aware of their existence, Castro's revolution should have failed, but he had three huge advantages. First, his men were true believers. It's much easier to risk one's life for a cause than for whatever pitiful salary they were getting from Batista. Second, the rebels, and particularly Fidel, were expert communicators. Their use of propaganda, especially through Radio Rebelde, which made it seem as though their forces were much larger than they actually were, and which allowed Castro to communicate with the country directly, made the military more likely to give up, which they did. Finally, at the end of his rule, Batista was truly unpopular. Once he lost the support of the military, it was over. Cornered and without options, Batista and many of his closest allies fled at dawn on January 1, 1959, paving the way for a total victory by the guerrilla forces. The Cuban Revolution had succeeded. The United States was one of the few countries to recognize the legitimacy of Castro's government, but tensions between Washington and Havana began to grow. First, once it became clear that despite Castro's repeated call for immediate, honest general elections, they would be postponed indefinitely, and later, when the radical nature of the movement became evident. In response, Castro opted for a goodwill tour of the U.S. in April 1959, but this failed to elicit any financial help from the Americans. As a result, with the Cuban economy in crisis, he soon turned to expropriation, forced lending, new and heavier taxation, and exchange control. He also opted to deepen his relationship with the Soviet Union. Soon Cuba would be ground zero in the Cold War rivalry between the US and the USSR. In the meantime, Castro continued to consolidate his regime. This came about through sustained mobilization, direct exhortation, and a top-to-bottom direction of an ongoing revolutionary agenda rather than through elections. Rewards and sanctions were utilized to elicit compliance with revolutionary policies, but care was exercised not to alienate key sectors of the working class, peasantry, and urban proletariat. These sectors formed the class basis for the new regime once the middle class had been destroyed and the upper strata had either left the country or accepted a dramatic loss in privilege and status. Daily life became intensely political. This helped the regime counter internal and external enemies. Most famously in 1961, when a group of Cuban exiles backed by the United States attempted to invade the island at the Bay of Pigs, an inlet in the Gulf of Cazones, about 200 kilometers or 125 miles from Havana. The Cuban Revolution did achieve major advances in health and education. Even now, its life expectancy is one of the highest in Latin America and comparable to that of the United States. Unfortunately, these achievements were at the cost of economic inefficiency, and given that a large part of the middle and upper class went into exile, the only way to offset them was through Soviet subsidies. This dependency on Soviet largesse left the country severely exposed when the USSR entered a crisis and later collapsed. When this happened in the early 1990s, Cuba faced a loss of $5 to $6 billion. The result was an extreme period of austerity, what the Cuban leadership called a special period in peacetime. During this time, consumption dropped dramatically, services and subsidies provided by the state were reduced or altogether eliminated, and the standard of living for the average individual or household fell precipitously. Cuba's gross domestic product fell 35 to 50% between 1989 and the mid-1990s, plunging the economy into a depression. For the government, catastrophic losses meant downsizing the state bureaucracy, shutting down factories and industries, and reducing or eliminating subsidies to the transportation system, agriculture, construction, housing, and other sectors. Unable to secure oil supplies due to the lack of hard currency, the government imposed draconian measures throughout the economy, causing total or partial blackouts on a regular basis. Energy supplies dwindled, while unemployment rose as workers saw their jobs and standard of living adversely affected. Extreme food shortages and electrical blackouts led to a brief period of unrest, including numerous anti-government protests, most notably one known as El Maleconazo in 1994, as well as widespread increases in urban crime. In response, the Cuban Communist Party formed hundreds of rapid action brigades to confront the protesters. Another way the regime attempted to deal with the problem was the introduction of a dual currency in 1994, officially known as the Cuban convertible peso, or what the Cubans called cucs or chavitos. The currency was pegged to the dollar and was originally supposed to be used exclusively by tourists to buy luxury items, which would then help the government gain hard currency. For the next 25 years, however, it expanded to the whole economy, creating massive inequality. That is because most Cubans were paid with regular Cuban pesos, or cups, which were exchanged 24-1 to cucs. This means that anyone that had access to tourist money was much better off than the rest of the population. For example, if a doctor got paid exclusively by the Cuban government, it would take a lot longer to make the same salary as a taxi driver if the latter was driving tourists around and getting paid in cucs. This created massive distortions to the economy, further hurting economic efficiency. The government was not blind to this problem, but it decided to phase out cucs only at the end of 2021. The main reason why it didn't do so earlier was because of the resulting inflation that would happen if the two currencies were linked. Meanwhile, Cuba remained a closed political system. Fidel remained firmly in charge until 2006, when, faced with serious illness, gave up power to his brother Raúl. Raúl, in turn, held on until April 2021, when Miguel Diaz Canel became the first secretary of the Communist Party. The transition brought little change, but almost immediately faced massive protests. The largest was in July 2021, known as the Patria y Vida protest because of the song that became its motto. They were triggered by shortages of food and medicine, as well as COVID restrictions, and spread all over the island before the government cracked down, imprisoning several hundred people over it. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has reversed some of the Trump Cuban policies, including resuming flights to the island, as well as facilitating family reunification. But there has been no restoration of the wet foot, dry foot policy, which allowed Cubans residency in the U.S. after only 1 year. This has meant that Cubans' attempt to leave the island is infinitely more difficult as they must go through Mexico. For decades, the Cuban Revolution has sustained itself by allowing immigration as an escape valve, courting allies that might subsidize its efforts, first with the USSR and later with Venezuela under Chavez, while opening up the economy in strategic sectors like tourism. This is no longer as viable as it once was. the country might yet have a top-down elite agreement that finally puts the island in a democratic path. But for now, that still seems a very distant prospect.